Africa's first climate summit has wrapped up with a call for rich countries to do more to help the continent develop a green economy. Leaders meeting in Nairobi secured $23 billion in green energy commitments from governments, banks and private industry.
How to adapt to increasingly extreme weather, conserve natural resources and source the funding needed to do so. Those were the key themes of the three-day Africa Climate Summit in Kenya. It ended with African leaders signing the so-called Nairobi Declaration. It sets out a common climate action agenda for the continent and will form the basis of Africa's negotiating position at the COP28 summit in November. In it, African leaders are demanding no less than a socio-economic sea change.
We demand a fair playing ground for our countries to access the investment needed to unlock the potential and translate it into opportunities. We further demand a just multilateral development finance architecture to liberate our economies from odious debt and onerous barriers to necessary financial resources.
Africa is the continent most affected by climate change, despite contributing the least to global warming. And yet accessing the financial means to combat its impact is largely out of Africa's reach. That was also lamented by UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who spoke at the summit on Tuesday. He praised the many sustainable energy projects already in operation across the continent and said it was time to end the injustices holding Africa back.
Now is the time to bring together African countries with developed countries, financial institutions and technological companies to create a true African renewable energy alliance. And all of that requires addressing another injustice, an outdated, unfair and dysfunctional global financial system. On average, African countries pay 4 times more for borrowing than the United States and 8 times more than the wealthiest European countries.
The Nairobi Declaration urges world leaders to introduce a global carbon taxation regime, including taxes on fossil fuel trade, maritime transport and aviation, and even to consider a global transaction tax, the profits to be used for climate-related investments. The Africa Climate Summit was the first intracontinental meeting of its kind, but it certainly won't be the last. The bottom line, despite bearing the world's heaviest climate change burden, Africa is far from being a helpless victim and has the potential to be a powerful ally in the fight against global warming.
Lots to talk about. Let's do that with Jennifer Morgan. She's Germany's Special Envoy for International Climate Action. She was in Nairobi representing Germany at the Climate Summit. Ms. Morgan, welcome to DW. Now, the final declaration proposes a global carbon tax regime to help fund climate action in vulnerable regions. That makes a lot of sense, but realistically, is that something we're likely to see implemented in the world's most polluting countries or even globally?
Well, I think, first of all, just to step back, I think that this Africa Climate Summit was a very welcome, very, I would say, path-breaking new initiative by President Ruto from Kenya to position Africa really as the part of the solution to the problem, but also, of course, needing the financing to do that so that they can benefit from the jobs that come from renewable energy. And one idea that the Africa Union is now proposing is this global carbon tax. I think obviously every country, every group of countries can bring forward their proposals, and it's clear, I mean, Europe, we do have an emissions trading system, so we do have a price on carbon, but the point is, we need to find innovative sources of financing. We need to reform the international financial institutions so that Africa now can get the financing it needs to develop in a green and sustainable way.
I want to dig a little deeper on the global financial system that you just mentioned there, because African nations argue that the crushing debt burden they have as part of that system is holding their climate efforts back. That is not news, but I want to know from you, is Germany going to push for reform in institutions like the World Bank, for example?
Germany is pushing, along with the United States and other countries, for reform of the international financial system. And Germany did, at the Africa Climate Summit, announce a debt relief, a climate swap of 60 million euros for Kenya, where they will now take those funds and invest them in sustainable agriculture, in renewable energy projects that they have identified. Obviously, Germany can do our part, but we need other countries to do so, other developed countries, but also countries like China that hold much of the world's debt. So yes to the World Bank reform, but also we need these types of debt swaps and others to come in order to give the fiscal space, as President Ruto puts it, for them to be developing in a sustainable way that they can profit from the green energy revolution that's going on.
Many activists, not all of them were able to take part in the discussions at the summit, of course, have criticized the focus on carbon credits at the summit. They argue that it's basically a get-out-of-jail-free card for the world's biggest polluters, and they're not wrong, are they?
Well, I think clearly any kind of carbon offset programs have to be incredibly carefully designed. We've seen recent studies that show that they can be misused, that there's fraud that occurs there, and that's not what Africa needs. Africa needs investment. Africa needs technology cooperation. Africa needs sustainable trade agreements. And so I think while we understand Africa's desire, or those countries, to have more input, more financing, Germany is actually quite cautious, and the European Union actually does not import or buy those types of carbon offset credits, because we want to make sure we have a very solid emissions trading system. So we need to find other mechanisms. That's for sure.
You say this was a great start, and the fact that Africa now has a more unified position to take to the COP later this year is certainly significant, but does it do much to change the fact that the world's top polluters won't pull their weight when it comes to emissions reductions and mitigation?
I think it can change the dynamic, and I think that's what the courage and the ambition of a President Ruto and the other leaders, he with 5 other African countries created a new renewable energy partnership. They are ready to forge forward, and the engagement of Africa and the solutions they want to have 300 gigawatts of renewable energy on their continent, that changes the dynamics in those negotiations. Europe is standing side by side with Africa, not on every detail, but on where they want to go in their development. And I think those dynamics moving into the COP28 in Dubai, which will be all about a global renewable energy target and a phase out of fossil fuels, I think, and a focus, of course, on the most vulnerable, is only a positive thing.
This is Jennifer Morgan. She's Germany's Special Envoy for International Climate Action. Thank you so much.
So let's get more on this. I'm delighted that we're able to speak to Mithika Mwenda, the co-founder and executive director of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, who took part in the Nairobi Climate Summit as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to start us off. Are you satisfied with the outcome of the summit and its final declaration?
Thank you very much, and I'm glad to share my perspectives a few hours after the Africa Climate Summit was closed. It's a mixed bag of fortunes. And one thing which this summit has achieved is the mobilization, both at the continental level and the global level, bringing the focus on the issues on climate change to a continent which is the most impacted, yet the least able to absorb the impacts of the changing climate. So yes, I think the whole week, the whole actually month was about that mobilization, capturing the imaginations, national, continental consciousness on really climate change. So that alone is really a milestone. Number two, in terms of the declaration, we have a fairly balanced declaration in terms of really listening to our leaders, talking about really almost coping and agreeing with us at the civil society on what we need. We have been telling them that we need to put pressure on the industrialized countries really to take drastic action and honor their commitments in terms of cutting emissions at domestic level based on science and the climate imperatives of climate justice, and secondly, also providing sufficient resources, that is climate finance, to enable Africa to absorb and rapid the impacts of climate change and for communities building resilience, but also supporting the just transition and acknowledging that Africa is rich in the transition minerals.
Forgive me for jumping in. I hear you loud and clear. There's this sense of unfairness that the industrialized nations are the ones that have committed more to global pollution and must now pay. I'm wondering what specific funding mechanisms you think are necessary to achieve the declaration's goals.
We have many funding mechanisms. We have the Green Climate Fund. We have the Adaptation Fund. We have a LDC fund, and just recently, in Sharm el-Sheikh, the global community agreed on the loss and damage facility, which is struggling. And of course, we have the transitional committee finishing its work for its delivery and the affirmation in COP28 in Dubai. So we have all these funds, but what is happening? Where the industrialized countries who have that obligation to provide their resources based on fairness, based on their shared, responsibility, they have not done that. We are seeing more of that money coming as loans, coming as being diverted to go now as bilateral, to use it to achieve their national and the political and economic interest in countries. So we are not seeing that commitment.
Yeah,
So
I'm so sorry. You're not seeing that commitment there. I'm afraid I have to jump in because we've run out of time. But thank you so much for joining us with that clear update from the summit. We really appreciate it. That is Mithika Mwenda from the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance.